My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old-school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, we put on our best resting beach faces as we go undercover on a Pacific islet where the Arasaka Brainworm awaits.
Our first segment is a basic crawl.
The Arasaka Brainworm is a 30-page adventure for Cyberpunk 2020. It was published by Atlas Games under license from Artausorian in 1991. It is written, or rather I should say designed, to quote the book, by Thomas M. Kane. Cover art was by Janet Aulisio, interior art by Brian Chesney, and editing and layout by Atlas head honcho John Nephew.
The book is divided into several sections. The first is the opening, in which the party is given some basic details about a job from their fixer, Diamond Blue. They are being tasked with getting to an island research facility on the Johnston Atoll being operated by a megacorporation called Biotechnica. There, they are to meet with a fellow named Brinkman, who's going to give them a sample of an experimental gastrophage, which they are then to smuggle out and return to Diamond Blue. Importantly, several very key pieces of information are missing from the mission brief, particularly that Biotechnica has hired the Arasaka Security Corporation to safeguard the facility. The party can hit the streets to learn some of these missing details, or they can plow ahead, confident in the information they have been given. The next section is called Getting In which various ways the party might infiltrate the Johnston Atoll are presented, such as stowing away on a Biotechnica aircraft, traveling by way of a ship commissioned for the purpose called the Wounded Gull, or being airdropped onto the islands.
Upon reaching Johnston Atoll, we get Welcome to Johnston, a section in which we learn about the major NPCs at the research facility, particularly Dr. Brinkman, also his Arasaka handler, Amalthea Lau, and a transportation director who is running a small criminal enterprise on the facility called Anatol. The next section is, very important, layout and security. This is an extensive chapter with maps, key locations on the atoll, details about security systems, Arasaka patrols, the elite Arasaka mobile team, and so forth. Concluding the adventure is Afterglow, which is a fancy title for an epilogue, and an appendix about the gastrophage nanotech that drives the adventure.
So let's talk about the ways we have used this module. Tom?
I merely read it, and on top of that, I vaguely remembered people talking about it in the 90s.
I ran a 4-session series of a game called Veil 2020, which I might talk about later, using the Arasaka Brainworm as our adventure. So things we liked. Tom, just from your read-through, what did you find appealing about this?
Oh, well, first off, I think it's interesting as a historical artifact. Not the first time we've said that about something. But in this case, it's an artifact from the kind of mainstream of gaming, really, from when it came out. Back in the early days of Atlas Games, when they were on, I think, the second edition of Ars Magica, that was their flagship product. But they kind of boosted their reputation among gamers who weren't interested in medieval wizards by licensing Cyberpunk 2020, and they made products like this, Chrome Berets, which, if I'm remembering correctly, is also kind of a islandy sandbox where you are on one side or the other of a guerrilla war, and Night City Stories, which I think was a bit more trad in its method of construction. And so it's interesting to look at this and kind of see, well, I'll kind of move on to my next one, which is that I think it is a nice combination of having a mission, but with a sandbox setting to do it in. And I think it just about evades what would have been my complaint when you first suggested doing this, which is that's not old school, nor is it OSR. But actually, I think there's a strand of old school kind of dungeon design that you can see at work here, even though it's kind of surrounded by the presentation of very trad gaming that was pretty much mandatory at the time, I think.
Well, that's a really interesting point, Tom. You know, we've never really explained Fear of a Black Dragon and what its aims and goals are and what our mission statement is in terms of what kind of modules we cover. We just have sort of been covering things, right? And so it never occurred to me that the Arasaka Brainworm doesn't fit our normal kind of thing. I mean, I know it's cyberpunk, you know, it's a cyberpunk game, so it sticks out in that way, but we also did a Call of Cthulhu thing, right? And so I suppose, like, what's your definition here? Like, what are you counting as old school, or why doesn't this count as old school?
Well, I think it's borderline old school in that it's old, so that would count for something. But I think, you know, if we talk about things that are definitely old school, you're looking at first edition D&D or AD&D, that kind of vintage 70s into the 80s, no problem. Once you get into the 90s, I think it gets sketchy just on age grounds. And of course, it's not OSR because it's not a conscious attempt to recapitulate that. But what I kind of mean when I talk about the mission playing into a sandbox is, and I armed myself with a Jeff Rientz quote for this very purpose. He recently posted-ish, I think, recently-ish, FYI, I'm never going to write an adventure that comes with a pre-baked ending. A good OSR module is always only a beginning and maybe a middle. The ending unfolds in play. Oh, that was on Twitter, it says in my notes. So yeah, and I think that's what the Arasaka Brainworm does. It doesn't have an ending. It sort of talks about how things might end up. You know, you might have to steal a boat and try to escape to the wounded gull over the horizon. But it just gives you this situation that's rich in possibility and leaves you to it. And that, I think, is very much at the core of OSR designs and what appeals to people about old school, early dungeon design.
You know, this kind of dovetails nicely into something that I really enjoyed about the module when you're talking about it being kind of a sandbox and like there not being an end, right? Like, and maybe a middle. It's really fascinating adventure to play because the beginning is so, like, there's a very distinct beginning. Like, it starts a certain way and you get your mission, but then it starts to, like, after that initial, like, okay, this is how we start, it really begins to, like, pull apart and it can go in lots of different directions. So, like, the decision you make about how to actually get to the atoll, that can go in one of several different directions, but it's still fairly confined. There's like 3 or 4 suggested ways, and you kind of choose one of those. And then once you get to the facility itself, it really opens up, and suddenly the adventure is kind of like just all middle, right? But it's lots of different like things you can do. You know, you have one mission, get the gastrophage out of the facility, but the module is actually really nice because it presents lots of possibilities for getting that done, right? There are a couple of little twists in there, which I'm going to talk about more in a bit, but basically the players get there and things are not as they were led to believe, right? Especially if they didn't do their groundwork, sufficiently before they got started. And so suddenly they have to adjust, and the module actually gives you lots of tools for like these adjustments the players might make and ways they might still be able to accomplish the mission. So it's really interesting in that way. And yeah, and there is no end. It's not even like, honestly, like the difficulty level of this module is really high, and it's not even like entirely clear if they can like succeed, you know, like the end, the end game is really, really like fuzzy here.
Well, I mean, just one of the things that appealed to me in that discussion of how things might turn out in the text is that it just suggests they'll get caught and maybe have their own memories edited and turned into kind of corporate brainworm slaves.
Yeah. I mean, I had a TPK. I mean, my characters all died. Yeah. So like they didn't survive it. So yeah. But so that was their ending. Their ending they didn't anticipate.
Now that, my friend, that is old school.
Thank you. Exactly right. What else did you like about it?
I also love the setting on the corporate atoll. It's this kind of cheerful, sun-drenched village of Homlet where, like, it's totally different from the standard grimy streets of Night City that a cyberpunk game would be used to. I really like that. I think it's a nice contrast, but I also think it's great the way it's, because it's an artificial island, it has that kind of creepy alienation that you need for a cyberpunk adventure.
I love it, and I'll tell you why. In Gauntlet spaces, at least, I'm not well regarded as a cyberpunk GM. I'm kind of notorious for how poor I am at science fiction generally, and especially cyberpunk. I just don't have I'm just not conversant in the language of cyberpunk. To me, it's all just neon and robot body parts, right? Like I don't really understand the genre that well. I've not read any of the literature. I don't keep up with it. I definitely don't understand like all the criticisms, although I'm getting better at that because of some people that I talk to a lot, like Fraser Simons, for example. But this module appealed to me expressly because it is not in a big sprawling city, right? Like it's in this island research facility thing. It has a James Bond vibe to it. You know, you don't have to be as conversant in all the texture, right? The aesthetic of cyberpunk. And so I found it to be very workable in that way. Anything else you want to say about the module, about what you liked?
Yeah, and to build on my appreciation of its cyberpunkness, but more in a more standard way, I just think while the interaction that the players will end up with their contact Brinkman is very human and kind of relatable in a fun way, the actual goal and the complication, which is to steal some medical nanotechnology.
Yeah, the gastrophage is like a nanobot
Yeah.
Nanosurgeon, it's called in the text, yeah.
And then when they show up, it turns out there's a sort of variant of this thing that can do Philip K. Dick style memory editing. That is super cyberpunk, and I love it, because it's easy to make cyberpunk adventures just like an action movie, but they've got robot arms, whereas this is actually something that I'm not going to say could only happen in a cyberpunk genre, because like in fantasy maybe someone could have a weird memory wizard spell thing, but it's a very, very cyberpunk kind of plotline.
Well, and that's exactly it, right? Like what I said earlier, this module doesn't really like lead into the aesthetic of cyberpunk so much. It still has all those themes, right? Like it has all those great cyberpunk themes, and it's got mega corporations and all that stuff. They're just on holiday.
Yeah.
That's basically it, right? You know, for me, I liked many of the things that you just discussed, but also this is something that you might only appreciate in play, and so maybe this is something that like I particularly like, you know, would have picked up on that maybe you didn't, Tom. But the central problem that the party has to deal with when they get to the facility is very fun. So they're expecting to talk to this guy Brinkman, who is going to be their point of contact to get the gastrophage sample out. But when they get there, they discover that he's had his memory tampered with by Dr. Lau. And in play, it's a very like, oh, fuck kind of moment, right? Because they get there and they're thinking, this guy has the sample. We're going to work with him. He's going to get us, he's going to have the way for us to get out. Like all this stuff is all set. We're just here to pick this thing up, maybe fight a couple of security guards and call it a day, right? It's not. They get there and suddenly they're kind of lost, right? Like they're just kind of, swinging in the wind or whatever, right? And so suddenly the mission shifts and it becomes about now figuring out how to complete the mission, right? And there are different ways you can do that. I was alluding to this earlier. You can try to counteract the brainworm to get Brinkman to return to normal. It turns out if they do some research, they can find out that Brinkman actually hid a sample with this sort of criminal element on the island. If they, can figure that out, they can go that route. There's different things they can do. And the whole situation is just really fun to play. I mean, Brinkman in his addled state, his memories having been tampered with, he's described as like having this almost like he has dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And so when you talk to him, out of embarrassment, he pretends to know who you are and pretends to know what's going on, right? And that moment in the role play is so good. Like, it's really, really good. This sort of like the dawning realization of the players that he doesn't really know who they are, and just the sort of misunderstanding of all that is really enjoyable. And also, we're told that Brinkman is prone to these very animated breakdowns in personality, right? And that's also very fun to play.
Yeah, I do like how it's sort of riffing on cyberpunk as an RPG genre as well, because by this time, I think already, the being betrayed or somehow tricked on a mission was a massive cliche. But in this case, the guy doing it doesn't know he's doing it, and he's kind of a nice guy. He genuinely wants to be your friend, sort of. So it's sort of a really interesting contrast there. And of course, it's on this ridiculously high security island. And that's what makes it, I think, would make it more unexpected. Because if it was easy to get on, then you'd be thinking, oh, well, the tough twist is coming up next. But because it's such a kind of tightly controlled space, you think, oh, this is the hard bit. Once we get there, everything's going to be great.
Yeah. And that's what's really great about it. I remember when people were recommending this module to me, I kind of put a call out on Twitter and other places like, hey, I want to run this game Veil 2020, which is a game that we published in our zine codex. And I need some old school cyberpunk modules, but I don't know cyberpunk, so give me something easy, give me something cool and classic, right? I was also thinking, great for Fear of a Black Dragon, give me something really classic, right? And so this was the recommendation, the number one recommendation I got. And I remember reading through it and thinking, what the fuck is this? Like, it's not even that, like it's okay on paper, like it's fine.
Yeah.
But it didn't like scream classic to me until we started playing. Once we started playing and some of those dynamics started to come out, it all became really clear, like, why this is such a great mission.
Yeah, I have a bit of a theory about why it's 30 pages long instead of 10. And that is that I think at the time, if you had just released an adventure that was the island by itself and said, figure out how to get there, and like just really given the classic OSR style bullet pointed motivations for each character, the market at the time would have gone, this isn't an adventure, this is just a map.
Right, exactly.
And so I think they had to camouflage their real intent by burying it a little bit in this kind of wordier text than it maybe needs to be.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Let's go to questions we had. So, Tom, hit me.
Okay, well, I'm curious about, you did 4 sessions. I'm curious about kind of what happened in those ones. And my first question is, did you even bother with the preliminary sneaking onto a plane scene that takes up quite a lot of space in the text?
Yes, yes, and it was really fun.
Okay, because it looked super lame.
No, it actually was. So, listeners, so you have the proper context. Like I said earlier in the opening crawl, you're given different possible ways of getting to the island.
So I believe a cyberpunk way to say it would be entry vectors.
Thank you, Tom. I told you I'm not conversant in the genre, so give me a break here. The preferred way of your fixer is that you sneak onto a biotechnica plane going to the island, and it's a whole like kind of hide in a crate or whatever, or maybe you find some way to get on the plane. Basically, it actually ended up being really fun in my group's session because they did a whole like, well, you know what? We're going to pretend to be Biotechnica employees, or we're going to try to get like we're going to pretend. I think they decided to pretend to be a person who needed like some kind of medical treatment that Biotechnica, some experimental thing Biotechnica was doing, and they had to get to the research facility as a result. And so they had to like, hack into a hospital subgrid to figure out to find a profile of somebody they could pretend to be and all this other stuff. It was enjoyable because in the text, what's really interesting in the text, you're told that all of the Biotechnica employees are, and I'm quoting the text here, they suffer from a grand apathy. That's what the text says, a grand apathy. So even if they suspect you're not on the up and up, they kind of don't care, or they just turn the other way. And there's something fun about your cyberpunks who are very focused on their mission. They have all this cool cyberware. They're fighting the man, but on the way to fighting the man, they're helping other corporations. There's that whole thing. And then they just interact with this average Joe who doesn't really care that much about Biotechnica, at the transport hangar, right? It's amusing.
It's good. I think it's also, it shows that it's written by someone who has worked in an office themselves.
Yeah, so, I know. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. What else you got, Tom?
One of my sort of more accusatory questions. There's a bit where the Arasaka security guards are impossible to deal with or negotiate with on the part of the PCs because, and this is their security measure, they only speak Korean. Now, one of the things Cyberpunk does is it's kind of international. How could you possibly figure it out? That was a bit of a weird note for me, especially since I'm pretty sure skill chips to make you speak languages are a thing in Cyberpunk. So it's not like...
Well, I'm led to believe that Korean, insofar as languages go, is not even a particularly difficult one to learn. So
no, it's got an alphabet, which kind of makes it easier than Chinese or Japanese, that kind of thing, yeah. I was going to ask what cover stories you used. You already did that.
No, this is actually... I want to say something here. This is really funny. So just by sheer happenstance, the person who needed this experimental medical treatment that they decided to pretend to be they actually told me as players, they're like, how about if it's an elderly Korean woman? And I was like, okay, great. They had a cyber, one of them had dermal implants so they could change the way they looked or whatever. And so it was very amusing. He did up his dermal implants to look like this elderly Korean woman. They have him in a hospital bed thing, with all the little things attached to it being pushed by the medic character, right? Pretending to be this woman's caretaker or whatever. Mm-hmm. And they're going to the hangar, to get on the Biotechnica plane. And what they didn't know is that Arasaka, that's a Korean corporation in the setting, Arasaka is handling security. And so they didn't know that. And so suddenly they encounter this security guy from Arasaka who is transferring over to the Johnson Atoll. And so that was fun. And then also I decided to just go one extra step further and make it that woman's grandson. So, so this Arasaka security guy, the grandson of the woman they're pretending to be, it was great. It was a really terrific scene. Just that whole thing. And he's very oh my goodness, grandmother, what's going on? Why are you here? All this,
That's pretty good.
It was good. Yeah. I mean, so that has nothing to do with the fact that that was just pure happenstance. I'm not sure that could have worked any better, right?
No,
it was total dumb luck. But as far as no, I agree. That's stupid that the Korean language is the thing that shuts them down, right? That's pretty dumb.
Yeah. I mean, in fairness, they might kind of guess that, Japanese would be useful and stock up on that. Maybe it's meant to be like a bluff like that. But yeah, it's a bit weird. My last question on this then is, in your game, what kind of direct knowledge or contact with the brainworm of the title did the players get? Because it's right there in the name of the adventure. But I don't know if it's that easy to really find out what's happening with it.
They didn't get a chance to. They knew that something was happening with Brinkman. They figured out that Dr. Lau is ostensibly a professor on the facility or a researcher at the facility, but she's also working for Arasaka. And so she is manipulating Brinkman because they're trying to commit some corporate espionage of their own vis-a-vis the gastrophage, right? And so, she puts the brainworm in him and, it causes him to be addled in the way he is. They didn't quite figure out what was going on. They knew something was going on, but they never got there.
That's a shame, because I think if I were to run this, my kind of number one priority would be to make at least one of the players think they might have a brainworm themselves because of the way they remembered things. So
yeah, that's pretty good.
You'd have to work pretty hard to set it up, I think. Maybe create some motif that suggests a false memory. Have Brinkman talk about, I don't know, blue light would be something David Lynch would do. And then and have done that before they arrived at the atoll. So then anyway, yeah, that was just my last question about it. I think that's a shame because I think it's a strong element of the adventure, and it would be nice if there were more ways, basically, for the players to find out about it.
Let's go to the chain lightning round. Tom kicks off.
I love that the real world has now caught up enough to Cyberpunk 2020 that the phrase €18,000 each, as presented in the text, is a real amount of money that a fixer could offer a bunch of shady operators. Although I will say that for the job in question, that is a bit of a lowball offer.
The plane that the characters can get on is run by a company called Konami, and I am thinking, Konami, like the video game company? Surely that's not what they mean. And so I looked up the word Konami to see if, perhaps that's a Japanese word that means lots of different things. It's not. Konami is a conjunction taken from sounds of the founders of the Konami video game company's names. And so my only conclusion I can reach is that in the future, Konami gets into air transport. I just thought that was a really cheesy detail that probably seemed really cool in the 90s when this was published.
Yeah. It's not all aged that well. I think Diamond Blue is a great name for a cyberpunk fixer, and I will be stealing it.
I agree completely. This is not so much a I love it chain lightning as much as a, this is the 90s chain lightning. This module is fantastically sexist, like so many things in the 90s were. And I want to just read to you the description of Dr. Amalthea Lau. Born in paradise, Amalthea has the almond eyes and long, shadowy hair of the Hawaiian girls in a shipwrecked sailor's dream. She majored in psychology at the University of Hawaii and applies her talents to a career in counterintelligence. Amalthea invented the Arasaka Brainworm. She also knows its limitations and is well versed in other means of persuasion. Amalthea knows what men want and can act well. She does not hesitate to flirt with PCs if the opportunity arises. Nevertheless, Amalthea's actual personality is cold and clinical. Although she routinely charms her suspects, she seldom sleeps with them and never falls in love.
Problematic neo-noir cyberpunk women? Check. Most of the facilities on the Johnston Atoll are housed in these kind of inflatable rubber dome things, which are, I think, just ridiculous enough. It's nice when cyberpunk sometimes just looks a little bit dumb, like it's just on the borderline of being a bit silly or a bit paranoia. So yeah, I like that.
In the section of the facility called the Special Materials Environment, we are given this evocative description. Here the PCs finally see the South Seas atoll of their dreams. Sun glistens on the blue lagoon. Palm fronds tremble in the breeze. Vines cover the ivory sausages which house Biotechnica's high-security laboratories.
Who amongst us has not dreamed of ivory sausages on a Pacific island?
It's true.
Oh, but before we conclude this segment, parrots, Jason, parrots.
Yes, they are the key to everything. Let's go to the Expert Delve now. It's the Expert Delve. Tom, what are we talking about today?
There is a whole section in the Arasaka Brainworm about how the response teams that are present on the island facility are, in a way, a challenge to your ability to be fair as a GM to the players, in that if all of these security forces showed up at once, they would immediately murder everyone in the party. Although I'm speaking to someone who did a TPK in their game, so maybe this is, casting the seeds upon stony ground. But I think that in the years since this was published, of course, being a fan of the players or the player characters has become a watchword. And we also have some things along the lines of grim portents, and indeed the engagement roles made popular in Blades in the Dark, which we have available to us. And I thought it might be interesting to talk about how we could use that kind of sort of timed, gradually ramping up response to make it easier to be fair in terms of dealing with especially a kind of stealthy undercover mission like in the Arasaka Brainworm, which I think is a little bit harder to GM than the traditional dungeon delving.
That's very interesting. Why don't we start with grim portents? How does that sound?
Sure. So just to, I guess, give context to those who don't know what grim portents are, this is a thing from Dungeon World where if there is a very bad event that will or may happen in the future of the scenario, grim portents are little signs that danger is getting closer, either in time or physical proximity. And in the case of, say, a dragon, might be something like the ground shaking, or you see, as you travel through a village, burnt and blackened remains of houses, that kind of thing. Just little warning signs that something bad is coming. They get more and more obvious as things get closer. Is that a fair summary?
I think that's perfect, yeah. I think what makes it different in Dungeon World and why it's this called out thing is because it's kind of mechanized, right? I mean, I think this is the sort of play that a good GM does anyway in any game, right? I think the good GM will always be telegraphing things like that. That's what creates drama. That's what creates a sense of momentum in the story, right? But what Dungeon World did is it really like kind of mechanized this idea. Not mechanized, that's the wrong word. But it emphasizes it in the GM's prep, right? To where the GM actually like has a number of different threats, like say 3 or 4 threats for the adventure. And then every threat has a list of grim portents, which are just like a little fictional countdown clock until the threat like actuates, right? And so I think in the way that it just sort of shapes the GM's prep and directs the GM to prepare in a certain way, to be thinking in terms of grim portents, I think that's what Dungeon World kind of did that was different than what other games do, right? It's a part of the structured prep process for running Dungeon World. But it's truly, I mean, this is one of the first subjects we covered in the show, right? Back in the Michael Prescott adventure.
The Skyblind Spire?
Skyblind Spire, yeah. It was a long time ago. We talked about this then, right? Like, but in that one, we were talking about grim portents as a way of helping emphasize the ecology of the dungeon, right? How grim portents can be used to telegraph that this is a living, breathing space. And what you're saying is, let's use grim portents as a way of minimizing the danger or telegraphing the danger? What do we think here?
Yeah, a little bit telegraphing, and that sounds terribly unsubtle. But the thing I've often found with not just cyberpunk, but also those adjacent genres of, maybe a bit of hard-boiled detecting or, James Bond-style espionage, is that it's a genre that's not about, clanking footsteps coming towards you. It's very easy to really hose the players basically by, you mess up your doing a convincing cover story roll and the guy hits a silent alarm under the desk and you've flipped a switch from everything is fine to everything is terrible, and there was never any real intermediate part in between. Right. There was no spectrum of danger. And I think that means that you're taking away, or you're just not presenting an option to make a decision. So like that choice, like, do I press on here or do I make my excuses and leave the guy with his finger hovering over the silent alarm and go talk to someone else? Do I waste time or do I take a risk and maybe trigger a security guard coming by? That kind of thing. That's an actual decision you can choose to make rather than just, you screwed up the roll, now the alarms are going off.
Yeah, this is actually really good, because I think if I had been a little bit more proactive about this in running Arasaka Brainworm, my players might have had a chance to survive, because indeed they did not. And I think where it kind of fell down for me, and I don't even think it really, quote, fell down. The players had a great time. They knew it was a limited time thing. They were not going to carry on with these characters, so they were okay with dying. But I think what happened for me was I was so focused on getting cyberpunk right, that I wasn't really dipping into my usual my GM toolbox and really, really like focusing on the things that make me a good GM, right? Like in terms of like managing, kind of pacing the story, doing those grim portents, the cinematic quality of all of it. I was very much focused on the cyberpunk part of it because it's a bit of a genre weakness for me. And so I know that's kind of what happened. And so I agree. I think that if for example, I had better, if I had telegraphed, because essentially how they all died was security team arrives, shoots them, right?
Yeah.
Like that's basically how this module goes, right? If the security teams arrive and they really can't survive, they're overpowered. There's just no way, right? It's really hard, and there's nowhere to go. Like, in Night City or whatever, you can just melt away into the streets, right? There's nowhere to run on this research facility because it's a little cluster of islands and floating bubbles, right? And so I just think that I probably could have done a better job of ramping up the security danger, right? Like, oh, here's some kind of indication that they're now at like security yellow or whatever, right? Like there are things I probably could have done to make it seem a little more obvious, like how dangerous the situation was getting. So what do we think as far as specifically the Arasaka Brainworm? Like what kinds of things do you think could we do?
Well, yeah, there are a lot of, I think you could prep a kind of list of genre appropriate tells that you could kind of turn to just to use as maybe a general warning. So, for example, you talk about the security level. Well, that's one thing. You might notice, in spy movies, you often have a bit where someone looks nervous and they look towards the door where they're expecting someone to come through. And that's the point at which you can tell the player who, their unasked, what should I be on the lookout for question is someone's going to come through that door. You notice them looking like they're waiting for someone to come. Or for the security levels as a mechanical thing, a little alert will flash up on someone's screen and the hacker character, Netrunner, will notice that, because they kind of keep an eye out for that kind of thing. So, yeah, I would kind of just probably prepare a little grab bag of just warning signs and use that that's for the warnings. And then these sort of ways to get away, I think that's trickier. I think you'd have to kind of, maybe go through each of the locations and just think about what's an escape route here that would just about work. Which might be something as desperate as clinging to the underside of a skiff, I think, in this particular location. But it'd have to be pretty good. Yeah, that's the prep that the Arasaka Brainworm does not do for you, and I think that's something that's missing from it.
I tend to agree. In this module, the players can actually move about fairly freely. One of the sort of conceptual ideas about this module that you have to really focus on is the fact that this facility is actually quite big. In the beginning, at least, you can kind of melt into it. As long as you don't appear like particularly conspicuous, you can kind of just move about, right? Again, we have that quote, grand apathy, right, of most of the Biotechnica employees. The Biotechnical employees are no problem. It's the Arasaka people who are a problem. So moving around is not too bad. The problem is once danger happens, like once, for example, you get on Dr. Lau's radar and she's ready to destroy you, like it's kind of game over. Like there's just, it's like two states, right? Having said that, there are a couple of things in the module that, the module actually presumes that this is going to be a very talky, role play heavy adventure. One of the things that you alluded to earlier is that it was a more free-form scenario hiding in trad clothes, right? It has that extra 20 pages of security stats or whatever, right? But the core of this module truly is just like role-playing. It's like talking to Brinkman, talking to Dr. Lau. And one of the things that I think might go unnoticed in the module is that Dr. Lau actually fucks with the party a little bit before she calls in the big guns. And I think you could maybe use Dr. Lau as your grim portent deliverer, right? Like, I actually did do this in the session. I had Dr. Lau like actually confront the party and say like, I know what you're up to, but I'm really curious about what you're doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I probably could have done a better job of like telegraphing that she's super dangerous, and so they should probably be careful, but yeah.
Yeah, actually, I think Dr. Lau is her write-up language aside is one of the like really interesting characters.
She is, yeah.
She's very cyberpunk in the way that she survives by making herself a useful just piece of meat for the corporation, basically. And she's done that to herself on purpose. That's how she survived. She's a very interestingly kind of compromised character in that sense.
Yeah,
it's just a shame all the stuff about, leggy mermaids. No, can you have a leggy mermaid? Not really. That's just a woman. So...
But she's a beautiful Hawaiian dream who's also cold and calculating. So yeah,
yeah. Anyway, let's move on to more stuff about expert delving, and then so I think that's kind of Grim Portents kind of covered. I think you just have to think about genre appropriate ways to use them to ramp them up.
I think that's terrific advice, and I wish we had done this before I ran the module. Unfortunately, the shackles of our format prevent it. So
yeah, that's The other thing I want to mention is the engagement roll from Blades in the Dark, which is basically essentially a randomization mechanic for how far into the job you get before something goes wrong. And that doesn't mean that the alarms have been set off and Arasaka are chasing you around in cool little speedboats with submachine guns. It means that literally the first hitch, like if the first problem is that the lock on the window of the house you're burgling is tougher than you expected. That's one thing. Or maybe you get inside the house and then you hit a lock you didn't expect. And I think that would be useful here as well, because it's similar to Grim Portents in the sense that you are telling the players outright, everything else went fine, this is good, this is good, this is good, and now you get a problem. It doesn't mean that the mission is over and that you have to switch to the emergency plan, but just there's something that needs to be dealt with on the fly rather than following your initial approach. What do you think about applying that?
It's interesting. I don't have a ton of experience with Blades in the Dark. I've run it, maybe half a dozen times or something. And I like that a lot. I think that's very interesting. I was running Arasaka Brainworm in a system called Veil 2020, which is a sort of slimmed down retro version of Fraser Simons' game The Veil. And it was specifically designed to be used with old school modules like this, right? Well, old school in quotes. We're
whatever.
Not sure if we're using that terminology or not today, but anyway, it was designed to run these old cyberpunk modules, and it has a World of Dungeons style die of fate mechanic where you roll the die of fate to determine the basic disposition of whatever the players are about to face. And I did that for their initial entry into the island. Basically I rolled the die of fate to determine how tough was security, how alert was security, how much stuff were they going to have to cope with. And that was actually really interesting because they got the good result, which is a 6 on the die of fate, which means, and they know that as players, they know as players.
I was going to ask,
yeah, they know as players that their entrance is going to be easy, right? But I think that perhaps that tricked them into thinking that it was going to be
true. Yeah, but I think it's great to roll in front of the players or to have them do it, as in Blades, because, as you mentioned, they know that it's going to be easy. Because one of the other issues with this kind of talky undercover game, or things where you have to bribe someone, bribery scenes in role-playing games are the worst because no one knows how much they're supposed to do. But in this case, they know it's going to be easy, so they don't get a false positive. There's no, he takes 5 seconds longer looking at your credentials than you expect.
Right,
let's bust out the machine guns and go. They know that it's an easy one, so they know they just have to go, maybe I could, buy you a milkshake in the corporate cafeteria, and they'll go, oh, sure. And then they know that's all that it's going to take. So I think that's a really valuable bit of stake setting, or kind of just, saying what the difficulty level is going to be at this point, even if you don't say specifically what they must do.
I agree completely. This is really one of those play culture things, right? I mean, this is a big, big play culture question. You may not have a table that can handle this appropriately, right? You might have a table of players who will try to game this, right? If they know that the die of fate, if the basic disposition is going to be really hard, they might just behave totally irrationally, right? Because they know that it's going to be a tough challenge, right? Or if it's going to be really easy, they might behave in a way that is not careful, right? They might decide I can just blow through this. I don't have to actually be a cool sneaky cyberpunk here or whatever, right? To me, that's a play culture issue as far as these engagement roles and things like that. I question if every table can get away with that kind of meta approach Just that's an aside. It's not that hard.
No.
It's not.
Give it a shot. Yeah.
I don't know what else we're going to say about this, but I think my big takeaway from this, because I feel like I'm just here learning from you right now, Tom. My big takeaway from this is going through that module, which is quite dense with security apparatuses, going through it and, like you said, noting down a few grim portents, a little countdown, a little like some possibilities of like how these things might reveal themselves in the fiction. Just noting that would have been really effective for me. I wish I'd done it. So, Tom, what else do you think we have to say about this? Are we good?
Yeah, I think we're good. I think it's a relatively simple answer to a difficult question and therefore of limited utility. But let's see how people do with it.
Indeed. Let's go to Companion Adventures. Hi, listeners. I wanted to let you know we have just kicked off Volume 3 of the Codex RPG zine. Can you believe it? The first issue in Volume 3 is Codex Flame. Here's what you'll find inside. Fire Ships at Midnight, a 3-player game that tells the story of the failed invasion of England by the Spanish Armada in 1588. A Handful of Ashes, a LARP about grieving and letting go. Like Matches to Paper Dolls, a play-by-mail game about love, longing, and missed connections. The Miscellany, 36 Separated Lovers, 5 original illustrations, and a custom layout by our new layout artist, Jake Householder. You can get Codex Flame by making a $4 or higher pledge at the Gauntlet Patreon, which is at patreon.com/gauntlet. And a quick reminder, we are currently running a Kickstarter campaign for the Codex Volume 1 hardcover book. That campaign ends on October 28th. Thanks. It's the Companion Adventures. Listeners, Tom has no doubt prepared a fantastic slate of well-researched companion adventures for you, and all of them taken in total will not be the equal of my first pick, which is A Night's Work, also known as the 1991 Shadowrun promo video. I love this so much. It's literally one of my favorite things in the world. It is my Patronus in some ways. It's everything I want to be. It's everything I want Cyberpunk to be. It is so good. I have nothing else to say about it. Just go YouTube it and watch it. It's amazing.
Yeah, okay. Let's see. So,
what's your first inferior selection, Tom?
My first inferior selection, Jason, is the novel A Scanner Darkly by Philip K. Dick, which is not like actually a cyberpunk novel, nor is it directly related to well-armed rapscallions doing industrial espionage. What it's about is an undercover cop who starts to get problems with his brain and memory and sense of self because he's taking too many of the drugs he's being undercover investigating. And it's all to do with kind of weird shattered identities and so on. I think maybe a good thing to read to get some ideas for the brainworm and its effects. And as I mentioned, if and when I run this, I really would like it to be a kind of strangely detached kind of corporate Muzak in the lifts hell.
That's a good aesthetic. So, that's a really good vibe for this. Yeah.
So like slightly unreal and a bit confusing. So I would want it to be like a Philip K. Dick novel. And if I may quickly move on to my second recommendation, because it is related, my music selection is the Vaporwave Mix Hawaiian Holiday, which has all the bizarre, distorted, alienating retro synth sounds you might want. And you can find that on YouTube.
I have a couple of music selections as well. They are both synthwave mixes, although one of them I don't think is really synthwave in my opinion, but whatever. But basically there are these cats on YouTube who collect various synthwave tracks and thread them all together in these, hour-long mixes. And I've got a couple here that are pretty good. One is called Glitch, which was put together by Astral Throb. I think I picked it just because of Astral Throb. No, It's actually really good. And Cyber City which was curated by Odysseus. It's good. Very cyberpunky. It's what I think cyberpunk sounds like.
I think you might be right. For film recommendations, obviously classics like Johnny Mnemonic, but no, Sneaking Onto Islands is basically all Bond films. So there's that. But also, perhaps more entertainingly than most of them, Enter the Dragon. So that's actually one entry vector that I don't think gets covered directly in the Arasaka Brainworm text, which is that you could sort of find out about an event that's going on and sign yourself up for it.
Oh, that's good.
Like a martial arts tournament, but maybe not a martial arts tournament.
Well, Dr. Amalthea Lau, in addition to being a cold calculating siren who knows what men want, is also a hand-to-hand combat expert. So
I see. And
on that note,
yeah, and crashing onto my final one as a bit of real life, which is that the actual Johnston Atoll, which by the way does not look very much like the map in the adventure, was a US military facility during the 20th century. Variously bioweapons testing area, missile base, and a chemical weapons storage dump. And I always find that kind of thing is very fun to allude to in cyberpunk settings. There's lots of war veterans and kind of fallout, metaphorical usually, in the Sprawl novels by William Gibson, so it's kind of a good callback to that. So yeah, go and look up Johnston Atoll on Wikipedia and learn.
Fantastic. Listeners, that's our show. We are a production of The Gauntlet. If you'd like to get in touch with us, just tweet at us at GauntletRPG. We are on G+. Just go to the community section of G+, and search for The Gauntlet. You will find us there. We have a website, gauntlet-rpg.com. We're on Patreon at patreon.com/gauntlet. And listeners, we presently have a fabulous Kickstarter going right now. Please go support our Kickstarter for the Codex Volume 1 hardcover book, which is a fabulous Gauntlet production. Thanks so much to our editor, Paul, and Tom. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. And listeners, thank you. Now get out.